Listen to a conversation between a student and an administrator in the University Employment Office.
Hi, I hope you can help me. I just transferred from Northeastern State University near Chicago.
Well, welcome to Central University. But Chicago's such a great city. Why'd you leave?
Everyone asks that. It's my hometown, and it was sure convenient to go to a school nearby. But Northeastern is still fairly small, and it doesn't have the program I'm interested in. I want to major in international studies, and the only program in the state is here.
We do have a great program. Well, how did you get interested in international studies?
My family hosted a few foreign exchange students while I was growing up. Then I took part in an international summer program after I graduated from high school. I found I really liked meeting people from all over, getting to know them.
Oh, okay. And that led you to our program. Right now, though, I assume you're looking for a job.
Yeah, a part-time job on campus. I thought I'd save money, being away from the big city, but it doesn't seem to be working that way. Anyway, I'm not having much luck.
I'm not surprised. Most of our campus jobs are taken in the first week or two of the semester. What work experience have you had?
Well, I worked in the university library last year, but I already checked at the library here. They said their remaining positions were for work-study students getting financial aid. I've never run into that before.
Well, I guess each school has its own policies. We really don't have much right now. You might be better off waiting until next semester. If you really want something, how are your computer skills?
About average, I'd say. I help teach some of the basic computer classes Northeastern offers for new users, if that helps any.
Okay. The technology support department needs people to work at its help desk. It's basically a customer service job. Answering questions, helping people solve their computer problems, give you a chance to develop your people skills.
Something every diplomat needs. But is there some problem? I mean, why is the job still open?
Well, they have extended hours from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. every day, so they need a large staff. But right now, they only need people early mornings, late nights, and weekends. You'd probably end up with a bit of everything rather than a regular spot. On the bright side, you'd probably be able to get some studying done between calls. At least it'd be a start, and then you can try for better hours next semester.
I see where the hours might be a problem. But I guess I can't afford to be too picky if I want a job. Still, maybe we can work something out.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
We really don't have much right now. You might be better off waiting until next semester. If you really want something...
Why does the woman say this?
If you really want something...
Listen to part of a lecture in an astronomy class.
We're going to start a study of sunspots today, and I think you'll find it rather interesting. Now, I'm going to assume that you know that sunspots, in the most basic terms, are dark spots on the sun's surface. That'll do for now. The ancient Chinese were the first to record observations of sunspots as early as the year 165. When later European astronomers wrote about sunspots, they didn't believe that the spots were actually on the sun. That's because of their belief at the time that the heavenly bodies, the sun, moon, stars, and planets, were perfect, without any flaws or blemishes. So the opinion was the spots were actually something else, like shadows of planets crossing the sun's face. And this was the thinking of European astronomers until the introduction of the telescope. Which brings us to our old friend Galileo. In the early 1600s, based on his observations of sunspots, Galileo proposed a new hypothesis. He pointed out that the shape of sunspots, well, the sunspots weren't circular. If they were shadows of the planets, they would be circular, right? So that was a problem for the prevailing view. And he also noticed that the shape of the sunspots changed as they seemed to move across the sun's surface. Maybe a particular sunspot was sort of square, then later it would become more lopsided, then later something else. So there's another problem with the shadow hypothesis, because the shape of a planet doesn't change. What Galileo proposed was that sunspots were indeed a feature of the sun, but he didn't know what kind of feature. He proposed that they might be clouds in the atmosphere, the solar atmosphere, especially because they seemed to change shape, and there was no predicting the changes. At least nothing Galileo could figure out. That random shape changing would be consistent with the spots being clouds. Over the next couple hundred years, a lot of hypotheses were tossed around. The spots were mountains, or holes in the solar atmosphere through which the dark surface of the sun could be seen. Then in 1843, an astronomer named Heinrich Schwabe made an interesting claim. Schwabe had been watching the sun every day that it was visible for 17 years, looking for evidence of a new planet. And he started keeping track of sunspots, mapping them so he wouldn't confuse them with any potential new planet. In the end, there was no planet, but there was evidence that the number of sunspots increased and decreased in a pattern that began repeating after 10 years. And that was a huge breakthrough. Another astronomer named Wolf kept track of the sun for an even longer period, 40 years actually. So Wolf did 40 years of research, and Schwabe did 17 years of research. I think there's a lesson there. Anyway, Wolf went through old records from various observatories in Europe and put together a history of sunspot observations going back about 100 years. From this information, he was able to confirm the existence of a pattern, a repeating cycle. But Wolf detected an 11-year cycle, not a 10-year cycle. 11-year cycles? Does that sound familiar to anyone? No? Well, geomagnetic activity, the natural variations in the Earth's magnetic field, it fluctuates in 11-year cycles. Well, we'll cover this later in the semester, but for now, scientists in the late 19th century were aware of geomagnetic cycles, so when they heard that the sunspot cycle was also 11 years, they just had to find out what was going on. Suddenly, everyone was doing studies of the possible relationship between the sun and the Earth. Did the sunspots cause the geomagnetic fields, or did the geomagnetic fields cause the sunspots? Or was there some other thing that caused both? And astronomers did eventually figure out what sunspots have to do with magnetic fields. Actually, they are magnetic fields. And the fact that sunspots are magnetic fields accounts for their dark appearance. That's because magnetic fields reduce the pressure exerted on the gases inside of them, making the spots cooler than the rest of the sun's surface. And since they're cooler, they're darker.
Listen to part of a lecture in an art history class.
Today, we'll continue our examination of ancient Roman sculpture. We've already looked at portrait sculpture, which are busts created to commemorate people who had died, and we've looked at relief sculpture, or sculpting on walls. And today, we look at yet another category of sculpture, copies. Roman sculptors often made copies of famous Greek sculptures.
Why did they do that?
Well, no one knows for sure. You see, in the late 4th century BC, the Romans began a campaign to expand the Roman Empire. And in 300 years, they had conquered most of the Mediterranean area and parts of Europe. You know the saying, to the victor belong the spoils? Well, the Roman army returned to Rome with many works of Greek art. It's probably fair to say that the Romans were impressed by Greek art and culture, and they began making copies of the Greek statues. Now, the dominant view in traditional art history is that Roman artists lacked creativity and skill, especially compared to the Greek artists who came before them. Essentially, the traditional view, a view that's been prevalent for over 250 years, is that the Romans copied Greek sculptures because they couldn't create sculpture of their own. But finally, some contemporary art historians have challenged this view. One is Elaine Gazda. Gazda says that there might be other reasons that Romans made copies. She wasn't convinced that it was because of a lack of creativity. Can anyone think of another possible reason?
Well, maybe they just admired the sculptures. They liked the way they looked.
Yes, that's one of Gazda's points. Another is that while nowadays reproduction is easy, it was not so easy in Roman times. Copying statues required a lot of skill, time, and effort. So Gazda hypothesizes that copying didn't indicate a lack of artistic imagination or skill on the part of Roman artists, but rather the Romans made copies because they admired Greek sculpture. Classical Greek statues represented an idealization of the human body and were considered quite beautiful at the time. Gazda also believes that it's been a mistake to dismiss the Roman copies as, copies for copy's sake, and not to consider the Roman function and meaning of the statues.
What do you mean, the Roman function? Weren't they just for decoration?
Well, not necessarily. Under the Emperor Augustus, at the height of the Roman Empire, portrait statues were sent throughout the empire. They were supposed to communicate specific ideas about the emperor and the imperial family, and to help inhabitants of the conquered areas become familiar with the Roman way of life. Roman coins were also distributed throughout the empire. Anybody care to guess what was on them?
The emperor's face?
That's right. The coins were easy to distribute, and they allowed people to see the emperor, or at least his likeness, and served as an additional reminder to let them know, who was in charge. And the images helped people become familiar with the emperor. Statues of him in different roles were sent all over the empire. Now, actually, some Roman sculptures were original, but others were exact copies of Greek statues. And some Roman sculptures were combinations of some sort. Some combined more than one Greek statue, and others combined a Greek god or an athlete with a Roman's head. At the time of Julius Caesar, it wasn't uncommon to create statues that had the body of a god and the head of an emperor. And the Romans were clever. What they did was they made plaster casts from molds of the sculptures. Then they shipped these plaster casts to workshops all over the empire, where they were replicated in marble or bronze. And on some statues, the heads were removable. They could put an emperor's head on different bodies, showing him doing different things. And then later, when the time came, they could even use the head of the next emperor on the same body.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Essentially, the traditional view, a view that's been prevalent for over 250 years, is that the Romans copied Greek sculptures because they couldn't create sculpture of their own. But finally, some contemporary art historians have challenged this view.
What does the professor imply when he says this?
But finally, some contemporary art historians have challenged this view.
Listen to a conversation between a student and his sociology professor.
Well, I'm glad you redid your outline. I've made a few comments, but nothing you have to act on. It's in good enough shape for you to start writing your paper.
Thanks. At first I was afraid all that prep work would be a waste of time.
Well, especially with a challenging topic like yours, factors leading to the emergence of sociology as an academic discipline. There's just so much history to consider, you could get lost without a solid outline. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's about... You mentioned needing volunteers for a research study?
Yep. It's not my study, it's my colleagues in the marketing department. She needs people to watch various new TV programs that haven't been broadcast yet. Then indicate on a survey whether they liked it, why, if they'd watch another episode. It'd be kind of fun. Plus, participants get a $50 gift certificate.
Oh, well, I like the sound of that. But, so they're trying to predict if these shows are going to succeed or fail, right? Based on students' opinions? Why would they care what we think?
Hey, don't sell yourself short. People your age are a very attractive market for advertisers who promote their products on television. The study's sponsored by a TV network. If enough students don't like a show, the network may actually reconsider putting it on the air.
Okay, well, how do I sign up?
You just add your name and phone number to this list and check a time slot. Although it looks like the only times left are next Monday morning and Thursday evening.
Oh, well, I have marketing and economics Monday mornings and Thursday.
Oh, you're taking a marketing class? Who's teaching it?
It's Professor Larkin, Intro to Marketing. He hasn't mentioned the study, though.
Oh, well, the marketing department's pretty big. I happen to be friends with the woman who's doing the TV study. Okay, well, we don't want you missing class. How's Thursday?
Oh, I work from 5 till 9 that night.
No flexibility with your schedule? Where do you work?
At Fox's Diner. I'm a server.
Oh, I love Fox's. I eat there every week. Maybe you could switch shifts with someone.
I'm still in training, and the only night my trainer works is Thursday.
Look, I know the owners there really well. Why don't you let me give them a call and explain the situation?
Okay. It'd be cool to be part of a real research study, and the gift certificate wouldn't hurt either.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Oh, you're taking a marketing class? Who's teaching it?
It's Professor Larkin, Intro to Marketing. He hasn't mentioned the study, though.
Oh, well, the marketing department's pretty big. I happen to be friends with the woman who's doing the TV study.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Oh, well, the marketing department's pretty big.
Listen to part of a lecture in a European history class.
In order to really study the social history of the Middle Ages, you have to understand the role of spices. Now, this might sound a little surprising, even a little strange, but what seem like little things now were back then actually rather big things. So, first let's define what a spice is. Technically speaking, a spice is part of an aromatic plant that is not a leaf or herb. Spices can come from tree bark, like cinnamon, plant roots, like ginger, flower buds like cloves. And in the Middle Ages, Europeans were familiar with lots of different spices, the most important being pepper, cloves, ginger, cinnamon, mace, and nutmeg. These spices literally dominated the way Europeans lived for centuries, how they traded, and even how they used their imaginations. So, why this medieval fascination with spices? We can boil it down to three general ideas, briefly. One was cost and rarity. Two was exotic taste and fragrance. And third, mysterious origins and kind of mythical status. Now, for cost and rarity, spices aren't native to Europe, and they had to be imported. Spices only grew in the East Indies, and, of course, transportation costs were astronomical. So spices were incredibly valuable, even from the very beginning. Here's an example. In 408 AD, the Gothic general who'd captured Rome demanded payment. He wanted 5,000 pounds of gold, among other things, but he also wanted 3,000 pounds of pepper. And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time. By the Middle Ages, spices were regarded as so important and expensive they were used in diplomacy, as gifts by heads of state and ambassadors. Now, for the taste. The diet then was relatively bland compared to today's. There wasn't much variety, especially the aristocracy, who tended to eat a lot of meat. They were always looking for new ways to prepare it, new sauces, new tastes, and this is where spices came in. Now, this is a good point to mention one of the biggest myths about spices. It's commonly said that medieval Europeans wanted spices to cover up the taste of spoiled meat, but this isn't really true. Anyone who had to worry about spoiled meat couldn't afford spices in the first place. If you could afford spices, you could definitely afford fresh meat. We also have evidence that various medieval markets employed a kind of police to make sure that people didn't sell spoiled food. And if you were caught doing it, you were subject to various fines, humiliating public punishments. So what actually was true was this. In order to have meat for the winter, people would preserve it in salt, not a spice. Spices actually aren't very effective as preservatives. And throughout winter, they would eat salted meat. But the taste of the stuff could grow really boring and depressing after a while. So the cooks started looking for new ways to improve the taste, and spices were the answer. Which brings us to mysterious origins and mythical status. Now, the ancient Romans had a thriving spice trade, and they sent their ships to the east and back. But when Rome collapsed in the 5th century and the Middle Ages began, direct trade stopped. And so did that kind of hands-on knowledge of travel and geography. Spices now came by way of the trade routes, with lots of intermediaries between the producer and the consumer. So these spices took on an air of mystery. Their origins were shrouded in exotic travels. They had the allure of the unknown, of wild places. Myths grew up of fantasy lands, magical, faraway places made entirely of food and spices. Add to that, spices themselves had always been considered special or magical, not just for eating, and this was already true in the ancient world where legends about spices were abundant. Spices inspired the medieval imagination. They were used as medicines to ward off diseases and mixed into perfumes, incense. They were used in religious rituals for thousands of years. They took on a life of their own, and they inspired the medieval imagination, spurred on the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, when famous explorers like Columbus and da Gama and Magellan left Europe in their ships. They weren't looking for a new world. They were looking for spices. And we know what important historical repercussions some of those voyages had.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Here's an example. In 408 AD, the Gothic general who'd captured Rome demanded payment. He wanted 5,000 pounds of gold, among other things, but he also wanted 3,000 pounds of pepper. And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time.
Why does the professor say this?
And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time.